Hi, my name is Kacee Ferrell Snyder. I am the director of the Center for Women and Gender Equity and the co-director of the Center for Violence Prevention and Education in the Division of Diversity and Belonging. I use she, her pronouns, and we are really excited that you all are here to join us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Stygles. I am Associate Director of our Office of Multicultural Affairs, also within BGSU's Division of Diversity and Belonging, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
So Katie and I were asked to be here today to chat with you all a little bit about allyship. The Chief Diversity and Belonging Officer, Jennifer McCary, asked us to spend a little bit of time talking about our experiences about that in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and our experiences in the office, in our offices and in the Division of Diversity and Belonging. So I am going to turn it over to Katie to talk a little bit about how we were called into this work. But before we get into that, I also want to share that this is not scripted at all. So Katie and I really just wanted to spend a little bit of time and have a conversation and chat about, like I said, our experiences, both within the division and in our lives and our background and how we came to this place. So we surely may make mistakes, and we have made mistakes in our experiences in the past. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But we just wanted to share that we're really excited to chat about this, but it's a conversation. So Katie, I will turn it over to you to talk a little bit about how we were called into doing this work, anti-racist work and social justice work.
Thanks, Kacee. So I think, thinking about my calling into this work really feels like something that happens over and over and over, right? Like there wasn't just one moment, but more like a series of moments or even movements that pulled me in. And I think the first, right, the one that I remember most clearly in the beginning is just seeing my parents and the way that they were doing the work. And they weren't even necessarily always explicitly naming like, this is social justice work or this is anti-racist work or those sorts of things, but really seeing them live out their values and calling attention to injustices in our community growing up and then doing something about it, right? So lots of service work and processing about what good service looks like. And, this wasn't just some like white savior complex type work that they were doing, but, they really actively worked to address injustices and inequity in our community. And I felt particularly called, I'd say, racial justice and then LGBTQ plus justice were the two things that brought me in most in that kind of, middle school, high schooler, thinking of things in these like single issue ways, which of course we know isn't the way our identities play out, right? But another example that I think of probably almost every single day in undergrad, I went to Xavier University in Cincinnati, and I was a music major, very small program. One of the music majors who was a couple of years ahead of me, now Dr. Tony Anderson, who is a Black man, also a vocalist like I was. We spent a lot of time just chatting. And so, he poured into me and took the time to help me understand, things like affirmative action are good, but they're not enough. And so, he's just one example of, this is all about real relationships that I have with people and, this relationship for me to doing the work, for me as a mother also, the importance of all of this. So kind of a roundabout way of getting to it there, but how did you get called in or pulled into this work?
Yeah, it's funny because it's one of those things that I have spent time reflecting on since we were asked to do this today. Um, because it's not something that I have really thought about a whole lot of how I came to this work. I just knew that this was something that I wanted to do. And I think that some of it is from my parents. My mom was a nurse and she worked in um, nursing for women. And so she worked at the health department and did a lot with women, infant, and children. She worked, and I'm from Bowling Green originally, so I grew up here. And she worked at the Children's Resource Center. And so that was her whole career. And so that was kind of, that was shown to me my whole life growing up. But I grew up in Bowling Green, so there's not a lot of, I guess, racial diversity, visual diversity in Bowling Green. And I grew up in like the 80s and 90s. So even, with LGBTQ plus issues, that was not really talked about, when I was in high school. And I think, you mentioned being a mother too. That's been something that's been really important to me since I've had kids, is thinking about how I model things for my boys. We have two young boys, and thinking about, especially within my work within the Center for Women and Gender Equity and Center for Violence Prevention and Education, how I teach them to be feminists, and how, I talk to them, how we talk to them about Black Lives Matter and what's going on in the world today, and how they can be involved with these things too. It doesn't start when you get to college or graduate school. Because I think for me, that's when I really started understanding a lot of these things. I maybe knew some of them in the back of my head, but I don't think I truly understood a lot of what intersectionality was, or, much about oppression, or like you sort of know, but you don't know. And so that's one of the things I think that's been really evident to me of late, is what's my role in sort of this next generation and with my kids, in addition to my work at BGSU.
Yeah. And I think that brings up a really good point, right? Because, you're talking about, these are things we learn. It's not just like, oh, now today this switch flipped and suddenly I understand the fullness of, the way that I contribute to these systems of injustice, or, it's something that just keeps happening, right?
Well, and things change too, I mean, I think back to my dissertation, and I did my dissertation on career satisfaction for women in student affairs, and I graduated in 2011. So even how I defined motherhood and women in 2011 versus how I would define it now would be so different, so it's like, it's an ever evolving thing. It's not like, oh, now I understand it, I'm good.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah. So what does that initial calling for you mean today in your role in the Division of Diversity and Belonging leadership team?
yeah, when I initially applied for this position, I've only been in my role since it hasn't even been a year. And I was really drawn to it because of gender equity issues. That was something that I was really interested in. I've always been really interested in it, and I was really excited about the possibility of it. I know I didn't fully understand what it meant to be a leader in the Division of Diversity and Belonging. And so that has been a really eye-opening experience for me, and I have learned so much in the past 9 or so months about that. So, serving on the leadership team with these rock star women who challenge me and will question, and the amount of support within that leadership team has been amazing. But like I said, I was thinking about, okay, how do I, as a leader in my centers, what's my role in that versus what is my role at the institution as a leader in diversity and belonging? And so that's something that I really have had to kind of step back and think about at a higher level. and how I'm representing the division and how I'm speaking up and speaking out and challenging things from that perspective and not just from the centers that I represent.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel similarly. I've been with the Office of Multicultural Affairs for a few years now, but my entree into that was specifically in LGBTQ plus programs and services, which was the majority of my role. And so I think for me, it has always been really important that I help our community as well as the broader LGBTQ plus community understand what it means when we say LGBTQ plus. And sometimes when we say that, we're really talking about white people. And a lot of times when we say it, we're really just talking about white, gay, and lesbian people. And a lot of times people who are bi or have fluid sexuality or gender outside of what's the norm get left out of the conversation. And that's particularly kind of mind blowing to me, given, we're not very far removed from the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement, which was led by Black and brown, queer and trans people.
Mm-hmm.
So, just to help folks understand, we have to recognize our history and how we continue to contribute to problems when we do things like whitewash our history and push people out of the community. And I think that my roles over time, as they've progressed into, different new leadership opportunities, I've really appreciated the way that I get to practice that allyship professionally, in asking who's not in the room, who's not being centered in this. Helping people understand that when we center the most marginalized, it doesn't harm people, but rather brings everybody in. And these are all things that I have learned from so many people before. This is not, Katie Stygles said, this thing, but what an opportunity it is to be able to do diversity and inclusion and belonging work, and what a responsibility it is that carries a lot of weight for us, right? I think women, we need to be sure that we are not putting the majority of the burden on, our leadership team is women of color, right? And so, that's saying, okay, when can I use my voice to speak up and say, that isn't right, instead of just looking to, other people on our leadership team who have identities as Black and women of color. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. And kind of going back to what you were saying before, I think that's been kind of a big shift for us in our office, is thinking about when we're thinking about gender issues and feminism and things. It's not just white feminist issues and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. I mean, things like housing and food insecurity and violence. All of those things are all feminist issues, but we tend to think about, feminism and gender equity and those kinds of things sort of from like a middle class white women perspective, right?
Right.
And so it's kind of forced us as a staff, not forced us, like we want to kind of take a step back and think about like, okay, so what are we doing and what are we missing? And because we're coming at this from a particular perspective. I mean, while the leadership team of diversity and belonging, we do have these amazing women of color and Black women. My staff is all white, right? So we tend to be coming at this from a particular perspective. So um, I that has been pretty important to us and something that we've really been talking about a lot too. Um, and I think, especially with what's been going on with Black Lives Matter, I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about, okay, knowing our leadership team and the pressures and the emotional labor and exhaustion, kind of what can we do to support the other people in the leadership team,
Mhm.
people in the division, and just generally. And I know one thing that when you and I were talking, that I was just like, yes, you said you had shared something with me about like asking what we can take off of their plates, right? So that I think was just one example of, because I hear from a lot of people, they say, well, I don't know what I can do. Like, what
Mhm.
do I do? I don't know what to do. And I think that's one small example of like, that's something very tangible you can do. And I think some of it gets into that whole idea of performative. Um,
Right.
you know what I mean? And I know that that's been a huge conversation on social media too. Like, are you doing things because it's coming from a place of um, wanting to do it and being part of the movement and valuing anti-racist work, or are you doing it because you want to make sure everybody sees that you did it and you can check it off the list and be like, okay, I posted my Black square and I'm good now.
Right. Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that's a struggle, and I think that's something that I think about a lot.
Yeah.
Of
So, I mean, at the heart of that, that's really asking, what does anti-racist allyship look like in practice? And I think, we've had the conversation in multiple different spaces recently, but like, we don't get to say, I'm an ally. Like, this is who I am, I'm an ally. And I think that it's something that people should approach with caution, right? If you're saying, I'm an ally to whatever marginalized community. Because I think far more important than that label is the behavior. And so, I like the way you phrased it recently when you said it's not a being, it's a doing. So, you know, recognizing that at multiple moments throughout the day, we might be doing things that are, um, anti-racist, and in the next moment, we might pass up an opportunity to be anti-racist, and because there's no middle ground. It's racist, anti-racist. There's no neutral, right? So it's recognizing that this is something we have to constantly work at. We have to listen, we have to learn, we have to be able to talk about it, we have to understand and challenge our own conceptions of identity. I think something that I think is really harmful, that I don't think people necessarily have terrible intentions with, but a lot of people get taught that to be a good white person, you should be colorblind, right?
Yes, I hear that a lot.
Colorblind philosophy. And I know a lot of really good people who, say that and mean well, but the problem is that colorblind philosophy erases identity and erases the fact that our systems, right? So laws and policies and, um, education is at its heart, um, a, a racist system. And so people don't move through that system the same way, like regardless of identity. So when we say, I don't see your identity, we're saying, I'm going to refuse to see how this system treats you differently than it treats me. And I think a lot of white people struggle with the idea, like maybe they don't have the easiest life. And so that whole idea of privilege, racial privilege, feels like, well, but I mean, I'm struggling, you know?
I've
I'm
had
like,
hard times. I've experienced these things too.
right, right. But, you know, I think I appreciate that, you know, you and I and our roles get to say, so let's think about that a little bit differently and hopefully help people come to the understanding that, you know, their identity as a white person isn't, you know, their race isn't what is complicating the way that they move through those systems. You know, there might be some socioeconomic or disability or gender or sexual orientation or, you know, all these other identities, but race, you know, is at the heart of so many of our nation's injustices,
Yeah,
right?
it's just ingrained in the
Mm-hmm.
systems.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, I also think about like when I pause sometimes before I do things. And, you know, whether it's like a social media post or whether it's before I say something or address something and question whether or not I'm saying it the right way or whether I'm writing it the right way or how I'm phrasing it because I don't want to be wrong. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what stops a lot of people from, maybe not a lot of people, it stops some people from doing
Mm-hmm.
anything, right? Because they're afraid they're going to be wrong and that they're going to be called out. And so they just choose not to do anything. They have that privilege to choose not to do anything, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and so how do you deal with that when you make mistakes? And I think that's something that it's like being an ally. Like it's an ongoing thing. It's not like you just get
Mm-hmm.
past that. And so I think for me, it's kind of just being vulnerable and saying, you know, there are a lot of people that don't get to make this choice of whether or not they address this. And so that's part of my responsibility in my leadership role in the in the division of diversity and belonging, that like this is something that I need to do, and also like as a human being, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I'm gonna make mistakes. I know I will, because this is these systems are things that we grew up with. These things are like ingrained in us and in our responses and in our experiences. And so I think there is a lot of vulnerability in it, and
Mm-hmm.
being okay with somebody calling you out or telling you like, nope. And I think you just have to kind of be okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And to listen to that, right? I mean, like you said, I make mistakes all the time, you know, and I think it's just, you know, a lot of people in academia are perfectionists, right? And I think that is a really dangerous trait when you combine it with doing social justice and anti-racist work, because we have to get out of that habit of, um, you know, oh, the inaction because of the fear of making mistakes, and we have to just say, yeah, we're going to make mistakes and it's going to be okay. And recognizing that that's not on, you know, Black and Indigenous and people of color to like pat us on the back for after and say like, oh, it's okay, you know, you're still a good person, or you know, if you miss the opportunity to call out some issue during a meeting, you know, you don't go to that colleague and say, gee, I realize I really should have said something, and expect them to be like, well, yeah, Katie, that's okay. You know, I just really appreciate, you know, you coming to me now. I mean, and that's not to say that that's not going to happen, but like, don't put the emotional, physical, mental, uh, all of the labor, right, off on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Um,
And I think that's true too with the education piece. It's not there
right,
to teach us
right.
how to do these things
Yeah.
or how to learn about it. I mean, especially right now, I mean, on social media alone, the number of resources and free resources is
Mm-hmm.
astronomical. So, if somebody says like, I don't know where to look, then you're not looking. You're not
Right.
trying that hard.
Right.
Um,
Google
yeah.
or whatever your search engine of choice is,
Yeah.
right?
Like I
But
always tell my kids, like, try again.
yeah. And I think, I've heard some people tell me with regard to many different identities, but I want to stick with race here, right? So I've heard people say, well, if I can't learn from Black people about Black people's experiences, then how am I supposed to learn? And so I think the really important thing to remember is we're not saying the education can't ever be from a Black person or from, if we're talking about LGBTQ issues, from somebody within the community. But in the age of the internet, we don't have to be like going to Jennifer McCary every single time and saying, hey, let me just tax you one more time identity. We've got people who have shared stories, shared experiences in videos and blogs and articles and movies and all these different medias, right? And along with that, how important it is to remember that there's no single experience of a Black person or a lesbian or somebody,
Fill in the blank.
yes.
Yeah.
So remembering that we have to do good research by using multiple sources to teach ourselves, right? And remembering how dangerous it can be to think, well, the one Black person that I asked said this, and so that's true of all people. We really have to avoid that kind of idea of the spokesperson.
Yeah.
So,
So what do you think about the whole idea of bringing people into allyship? How do we do that?
yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to bring people in because I think we have to recognize that racism is not something that can be cured by any one person. And it certainly can't be cured by Black people alone, right? Racism is a white person's problem. And so white people have to be brought in to be the solution there, to be part of the solution in a collective. So I think it can be really important to have these types of conversations with people. I think it happens at work with our colleagues. It happens with our students, who often I learn far more from.
Yes.
We've got to be willing to do it at home. Um, Especially for us. I know we share that belief as parents about what a responsibility we have to make sure that our children are contributing to society in anti-racist ways too. But I do think there have to be real relationships for some of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, putting ourselves out there and saying, I recently said in one of the administrative staff council meetings, like, if anybody needs a white person to talk to about these things, I'm putting myself out there. This is something that I'm willing to do. So, I mean, that's not the whole answer, but
Yeah.
I think calling people out in a way that isn't, what's the word I want to use here? Like overly,
Critical. It's more
yeah.
like the calling out versus calling in kind of idea.
Yeah, but I mean, sometimes
You need to call them out.
sometimes you need to call somebody out. And sometimes when somebody's done real harm, I mean,
Yes.
it's kind of like physics, right? For every action, right? So, but I think I try not to start with the like,
Oh, like somebody's coming, like a bad intentioned kind of thing.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too, because there is such momentum right now, um, that so many people, are behind this. And there's a lot of people who are like, there are a lot of white people who are involved in the Black Lives Matter movement right now. But it goes back to that kind of question of performative involvement
Yeah.
and keeping the momentum up and staying
Right.
involved. And what does that look like long term? Like we were
Right.
saying, you don't arrive as an ally and then you are like you continue. It's a continuous. It's a verb, right?
Right.
So
Right.
keeping those people involved and bringing other people into the work as well. Yeah, I think all of those things that you said make sense, and I think sometimes it's by centimeters, right? I mean, there are some
Yeah.
people that you aren't going to change their involvement from, something from nothing to everything. So it might be just by little bits, um, but not giving up,
Yeah. Yeah. That's the most important thing. We don't get to be tired, right? There will be times that it will feel tiring, but we don't get to be tired. White people don't get to be tired. We don't get to stop pushing. We don't get to stop calling things out. We don't get to stop supporting our Black, Indigenous, and people of color colleagues. We just don't.
Mhm. Yeah.
So,
Well, we should probably wrap this up. Um, do you have any last thoughts that you want to share, Katie?
well, I mean, I think we'll probably watch this and think of a million things we wish we would have said, right? So I think it's really important to remind folks that there's no way that we could cover all of the important pieces of anti-racist allyship in however long this conversation has been now. So this is a conversation that can't stop here, and I know because of our relationship, like we won't stop having the conversation, but I also want to make sure that people understand that we are inviting them into this conversation with us too. So I really hope that, we'll have people who say, I want to be part of this. Let's talk. Can we talk? I'd love to see this become, something that can happen in more formalized ways through our division.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that continuation of this, whether it's something formal in the division or informal, that somebody just says, like, I saw this and I want to chat with you. And there's a lot of other programming I know that the division has planned throughout the summer and the fall too, that I think those will be opportunities for people to talk informally and formally as well. But yeah, I think hopefully too, we have shown people that like it's okay to be vulnerable and have these conversations, and hopefully they follow up and chat with us and talk to each other about this, because it's not a one-time conversation for sure. So
Yeah.
thank you to everybody
Thank
who joined
you.
us, and thank you to Katie. It's always a
Thank you,
pleasure.
Kacee.
Yeah. And hope everybody is staying safe, and we will see you all back in the fall.